Hello, and welcome to Let's Just Talk. I'm your host, Hammi. Today, we'll be discussing the ongoing protest in China. To offer his thoughts on this issue, we are joined by Dr. Ben Xu. Dr. Ben Xu is an Associate Professor of Sociology at Emory University. His research interests include civil society, collective memory, and symbolic politics with a regional expertise on contemporary China. He is the author of 3 books: The Politics of Compassion, The Sichuan Earthquake, and Civic Engagement in China. The second book is Chairman Mao's Children, Generation and Politics of Memory in China. And the third is The Culture of Democracy, a sociological approach to civil society, as well as many articles in leading public and academic journals. To begin, Dr. Xu, first, welcome to Let's Just Talk. We are happy to have you here. To get us started, can you help our audience understand and give us an update on what is currently happening in China?
Yeah, sure. So the protests against the zero COVID policy and other issues were largely suppressed by the Chinese government. What is dramatic and also important now is the policy itself has changed in a quite U-turn way. In other words, the previous draconian measures were abandoned, and the regular PCR tests were not required, and official narrative also changed. So in previous official narrative, the danger of the virus was exaggerated, but now the government told people that the virus now is becoming very mild, and now you can go out, but we see a very, very dramatic increase of cases of infection since the policy changed, even though the official statistics are believed to be much lower than the actual cases. So now if this is what we have now in China.
Thank you, Dr. Xu. I want to go back a little bit and have you highlight for us what issues made people take to the streets after this long term of cooperation with government lockdown.
Yeah, there are lots of long-term causes and also short-term causes. The triggering event was a fire incident in Urumqi, the capital of Xinjiang Autonomous Region. So what happened at the time, there was a fire in a high-rise residential building, and then the fire trucks cannot get into the residential area because of the entrance was blocked by some physical barriers, and also the cars were abandoned by those people who were in quarantine. So some of the videos showed that the water from the fire trucks can barely reach that building. And as a result, many people actually died in that building. Most of them were Uyghur people, the ethnic minority people in Xinjiang autonomous region. And the background for that Urumqi incident is that the residents in Urumqi have been locked down at home for more than 100 days.
Wow.
So the incident triggered and provoked lots of protests around that city and against the lockdown policy. And also it provoked other protests as well. For example, the students and the younger generations protests in Shanghai, in Nanjing, in Beijing, and other places on college campuses and on the streets and other cities as well. But those protests should be put into the context. One is that we should not forget some of the protests before the Urumqi incident. There was a protest in Foxconn factories in Henan province. So for those of you who don't know much about iPhone, Foxconn factories were the suppliers of and assemblers of your iPhones. And then the workers got into serious conflicts with the factory authorities and the police as well. And the confrontation became pretty violent. And also later in Guangzhou, in one of the areas in Guangzhou City, that the migrant workers and the migrant business owners got into confrontation with the government as well, and it became pretty violent as well. So it was a large wave of protests in China around that time. I guess the problems are mainly the direct issues is the COVID-19 policy, and people have been locked down for a while, and their life was seriously disrupted. And also, there's long-term issues about freedom of speech, about whether the residents in Xinjiang can air their grievances, and
Mm.
also the Chinese people's general dissatisfaction and the frustration, and all these issues led to this large wave of protests.
Thank you for that, Dr. Shu. Speaking of, because you started historicizing a bit about how we got here and like the different waves of protests that have occurred up until now. Um, there are so many people online that are wondering whether this, what is the significance of like the white paper protests that are occurring right now, and they're wondering, is this 1989 or will it lead to any structural or systemic changes? Um, and as we've seen, is change the COVID policies at least.
Mhm.
What is your take on the questions people are asking themselves about the meaning and the significance of this of these protests?
I think structural or policy change and even regime change are just several of the outcomes of any social movement. And we need to expand our scope to look at the impacts of protests.
Mm.
Whether this protest led to the COVID policy change remains debatable. And it might be one of the reasons for the change, but we are not sure now because we don't know exactly what happened at a higher level
Right,
of politics.
right.
But I want to emphasize that the outcomes of these protests are not just limited to policy changes,
Mm-hmm.
but also the impacts on the protesters themselves. In
Right.
other words, those younger generations' small actions are not insignificant.
Mm-hmm.
They change their awareness of the political and the social issues in China.
Mm-hmm.
They also change their way of thinking.
Right.
It's almost like awakening moments for many of them, and they know that there's an alternative choice of action. They can get their voice heard. They can say that publicly. They can imagine an alternative future, which is not really something that you can find in sensational moments, but it's very gradual, quiet changes that will have long-term impacts um, on the future of China.
Thank you, Dr. Shu. Following up on that, you mentioned young people um, several times now. Could you speak about the role that young people are playing in this movement? Because we know that a lot of the protests erupted within universities, such as like Peking University and Tsinghua University. And so,
Mhm.
what role are young people playing in this movement, and how is it spreading across universities, across places, and what is your overall look into into what is happening?
Okay, so um, the participants of the protests include not just the young people, but also, well, migrant workers, most of them are young,
Mm-hmm.
actually. So the migrant workers in Foxconn factories and in Guangzhou as well. But the most vocal participants of this movement are the young people,
Mm-hmm.
particularly the college students you mentioned, and also college educated urban professionals who join in the protest in Shanghai in particular, and they get their voice heard. I guess it's not surprising to see this younger generation. The prevalent misconception about this generation is that those people are very nationalistic
Mm-hmm.
and pro CCP and pro government, and they got into debates with outside people about China, had painted a pretty positive picture of China. But that's a misconception, I would say. If you look at these people and their growing up experience, they usually were born in the 1990s
Mm-hmm.
in a time when China was more connected to the outside world. They're really a global generation.
Okay.
And they went abroad for tourism, and some of them studied abroad, came back to China, and then some of them were residing in other countries and working and studying and so on and so forth. So they're more connected to global world, and this is also one of the reasons why the protests in China provoked lots of protests, got a lot of residents outside of China in almost all major university campuses in the United States, in other countries as well. So the younger generation's role is very obvious. Another thing about this younger generation is the role of young women.
Mm,
And young women were very vocal, very daring,
right.
and were not afraid of being caught. And you see that a young woman on the front line, and they actually chanted
Mm,
and slogans, and then also they were the people who are the driving force of some of the protests, and they got arrested and so on and so forth. I'm not surprised at all because if you know the past 20 years in
mm,
China, you find that most of the social movements are dormant.
mm,
But there's one particular movement which has been more and more active, that is the feminist movement in China.
mm,
And it was one of the most successful social movement in the past decade if you measure the success by its social influence instead of policy change.
mm.
Lots of high profile cases were the key moments for the feminist movement and to develop and also enhance awareness of gender specific issues. So I would say, even the protests were suppressed. Now we see the promising future for this younger generation in China.
Thank you, Dr. Shu. And we can see the role that women are playing globally across countries in
Yes,
changing unjust and unfair status quos
in
and
Iran.
transforming
Yeah.
their own societies
Mhm.
all across the globe. And speaking, you mentioned slogan. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit because it seems as though, from like an outsider's perspective, that there is a conflict between some of the protesters who are chanting to an end to the zero tolerance COVID policies, and others who are chanting for things like democracy and freedom and
Mhm.
justice and all the and voting rights and so on. So could you talk about how do we reconcile these seemingly from an outside perspective
Mhm.
differing views of what the cause is for like these protests, like why people are out there, like what is
Yeah,
the conflict?
I want to say most protests are multivocal. In other words, you see different voices and
Mm,
different demands from different participants of the social movement. So it's not surprising to see like you hear different voices
mm,
and also different slogans from this wave of protests. So for some people, the lockdown policy was the immediate goal, and if this goal has been achieved and policy is changed, then they will be temporarily satisfied and will not take to the street.
right.
But for others, particularly, I just mentioned the younger generation, and they believe that the problem is not just about this specific policy.
Mm,
It is about some of the problems in the system. For example, freedom of speech, freedom of mobility, and particularly freedom of mobility is quite conspicuous in this in the past 3 years, because the lockdown means that you don't really have the freedom of mobility. You cannot get outside of your residential area or your building and even your home. And people realize that the freedom is not just an empty slogan, but has to do with my livelihood. It has something to do with whether I can get my food, get my medical care, get everything that I take for granted in everyday life. So
mm,
freedom is not a sort of a empty slogan anymore. It is something that is so concrete and so specific. So I would say I don't see the conflicts between these two sort of lines of thinking,
right.
or rather, in some places, and we will see that they actually converge, such as freedom and also anti lockdown policy. Something that two things are in one, in specific and also in general demands. But I would also emphasize that when some protesters in China chanted Xi Jinping stepped down, CCP stepped down, it was a very striking and surprising moment for many, even for outside observers and China experts.
Mm,
It was such a straightforward slogan, but as I said on my social media, that the protester who chanted that slogan were the boy in Anderson's tale, Emperor's New Clothes, that the emperor has no clothes. And so it was so true that people actually um, attribute all these problems to the regime, to the party, and to the leader himself. So that was a moment that actually was very important. And later you can see slogans and also signs around the world, not just about the COVID policy, but about democracy, about freedom, about the leadership, about the CCP, and also other voices are got into the protests. For example, the solidarity with the wayward people who were the main residents in Xinjiang, and also other issues as well. So this is a very multi-vocal protest we are looking at.
Thank you so much for that. And someone suggested I ask the following question, which is that some protesters have been arrested and many others have not been arrested yet. And
Mhm.
whether or not you think the non-arrested protesters will face repercussions later down the line under the pretense of maintaining stability and accountability and so on.
Um, I won't be surprised if they're interrogated by the authorities. And that's basically the standard practice in China. After every movement, and those participants will get into trouble with the authorities. So it shouldn't be a big surprise if we see that those college students back to their campus were interrogated by, the teachers who are in charge of a political ideological propaganda and so on and so forth. Their future will be affected. This is just something that we expect under an authoritarian regime. And whether, about the scale and the scope of how many people were being affected, we still don't know whether the authorities will want to downplay this protest or they want to make a big issue like in 1989 Tiananmen. We still don't know. But I would say it's less likely to become another 89 movement in terms of the impacts.
Okay. And then you mentioned earlier, before we end, you mentioned that the new solidarity with Uyghurs.
Mhm.
Is this something that you see continuing, or is that just uh, in the spirit of the moment that like the spark, but after the spark, there's no more solidarity behind that issue?
Yeah, that's a very good question. We need to wait and see. But at the moment, we see the spirit of solidarity coming from an emotional expression about their frustration about the surveillance and the lockdown, which resembled the experience of the wayward people in Xinjiang for many, many years. And some people said that now I realize and understand how actually wayward people feel and at the time. And some people even say we apologize to Uyghur people for our ignorance of their experience and without being in solidarity with Uyghur people earlier. So I guess this is at least a very good starting point for the majority, the ethnic majority in China was Han people, to rethink about suffering of others. If the others are defined as the perceptions of those ethnic groups who are considered as minority, but usually people don't really care about how they experience the surveillance and also other tight control over their daily life. At least it's the good starting point. Whether it becomes something that is permanent depends on a lot of factors we still cannot foresee now.
Thank you so much. And lastly, to send us away, what responses do you anticipate from the CCP, or what other outcomes do you anticipate? What are possible avenues or policy solutions that will come from this movement or protest that we're seeing in China?
One thing is that it's very clear now the government tries to manipulate the numbers and the rhetoric again to keep the number as low as possible. We already see that in Beijing. So in the past week, the cases of infection have increased dramatically, but in the past 2 days, and the cases are going down. And so, which is very abnormal. And if you know some of the basic knowledge about, pandemic, and it's almost impossible given the situation in Beijing. So another thing is about the rhetoric. So all the rhetoric about a virus is that everyone stays at home, and this is the most effective way to control the virus. But now the political rhetoric is not that, the government has protected you for 3 years, now you're on your own. So this is more like, paternalistic rhetoric that, to imagine the people as children. Now you grew up and parents will not take care of you and you're on your own, that kind of a rhetoric. But, given the prevalent mentality among the Chinese people, I would foresee that many people will still believing that kind of rhetoric in the future. But in the near future, I believe the virus will gradually fade into history, probably 1 year or 2 years. But the problem is really about the social costs in this fading process. How many people will die from excessive deaths, from lack of medical resources, and so on and so forth. And so that's basically what we can see that the government will respond to the current situation. In terms of the protests, I want to say the government will be more cautious about social unrest, particularly on college campuses, which are have been quiet for almost like 20 years or 30 years, but now all of a sudden you have a younger generation of students who are so brave and who are so vocal, and sometimes even just make a very general demand for the political regime to change, not only to change, but also to collapse. That's something that actually frightens the current regime.
Dr. Shu, thank you so much for taking your time and being on Let's Just Talk with me. We'll look forward to continuing these conversations with you.
Thank you very much for having me.